Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Megan O'Leary. I am Blue Sky Maritime Coalition's Director of Operations, and we're so pleased to have you all here. We are presenting today about the Poseidon Principles, and we're so pleased to have Michael Parker, Alan Ginsberg, and David Cummins sharing with us for the next hour about how this impacts U.S. domestic maritime. Also want to give a special thank you to Holland and Knight and Jovi Tenev. Holland and Knight is a Blue Sky Maritime Coalition founding member, and they have shared their New York City offices with Blue Sky today. But before we get into everything, I'd like to read Blue Sky's antitrust statement. We're meeting today in furtherance of the Coalition's goal of promoting policies and encouraging innovation in commercial and operational practices to help accelerate development of net zero emissions vessels and necessary infrastructure. Although these purposes are pro-competitive and recognized to be legitimate and permissible under the antitrust laws, we still need to remember that many of us are competitors of one another, and that if our discussion strays from these permitted topics, it might later raise suspicions that we engaged in anti-competitive conduct and subject the coalition and participants to a potential antitrust investigation or worse, an antitrust lawsuit. Accordingly, participants should avoid in the meeting or in informal communications outside the meeting any discussions of any participants or industry participants' prices, profits, bids, plans, suppliers, or other matters of competitive sensitivity. So with our antitrust statement out of the way, just want to welcome everyone again. We have until 4:05 Eastern, so 1 hour from now, to review this global framework applying the Poseidon Principles to U.S. domestic maritime operations. We're so pleased to have Michael Parker, who's the chairman of Global Shipping, Logistics, and Offshore at Citi, a Blue Sky founding member, Alan Ginsberg, CFO of McAllister Towing, also a Blue Sky founding member, and David Cummins, Blue Sky Maritime Coalition's president and CEO. So for this session, I'm going to hand it over in just a moment to our presenters. They are going to run through some slides. They'll each have some time to speak. Alan is going to moderate the conversation. And then after that, we will open it up for conversation and discussion. Just a reminder that this session is recorded. So if you feel comfortable, we welcome you to turn on your camera and come off mute during the conversation portion of this. The recording will be made available on Blue Sky's website, bluesky-maritime.org. If you don't feel comfortable having your image and voice recorded, you're welcome to stay on mute. There are a few ways to ask questions to the presenters. You can put it into the chat. You can also raise your virtual hand. So those options are available at the top banner of your screen. And with all of that, I would like to hand it over to our presenters and Alan Ginsberg.
So we've spent enough time on that. Michael, would you please kick us off?
Megan, if we can have the first slide, please. If we can move to the first slide of the Poseidon Principles. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me, David and Alan, to come and talk about this. I just want to assure people I'm not here to propose that the US maritime lenders should sign up to today's Poseidon Principles, which are very much guided by the International Maritime Organization. I fully recognize the US and Canada have a different regime. But by the end of this, I hope that we'll have some common ground, that what we've done in a global sphere will be applicable in some way, to the North American lenders in the waterborne maritime transport business. So the Poseidon Principles are a global framework. We go back to the Equator Principles of 2003, where international banks agreed to disclose the project finance transactions that they undertook, so that the issues around indigenous peoples, the environment, those sort of issues which banks were being criticized for, there was full disclosure. Again, it was being about transparent around the business being done. In 2015, the G20 set up a body led by Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, which came up with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And here we are 9 years later, and you can begin to see the impact that has pretty broadly globally around disclosure of environmental factors by financial institutions. And then around the time of 2019, which is when we launched the Poseidon Principles, the principles of responsible banking came into being. Now, in June 2019, not far from here, in fact, we launched the Poseidon Principles, so we'll celebrate our 5th anniversary next year. We were helped by the IMO decision in April 2018 to come up with its ambition that international shipping should reduce its carbon emissions by 50% by 2050 based on 2008 data. Well, we've come a long way since then, and really, as you know from the IMO decisions in July, the IMO has essentially set a path to decarbonize the international shipping industry by 2050. Next slide, please, Megan. I just want to talk about the IMO very briefly. These slides, attendees can get a copy of these slides. But essentially, the IMO is a UN body, a specialized agency of the United Nations to set standards for safety, security, and environmental performance of international shipping. It's really that role as the regulator of international shipping that has a very broad impact. And we're beginning to see some very specific regulation beginning to be formulated around decarbonisation. We had IMO 2020, which is about removing sulfur from fuel, and we've had ballast water treatment. Those are the two most global pieces of regulation recently. The IMO does not govern US and Canadian coastal or inland shipping, but obviously has some influence given the fact that the United States ports receive and export significant amounts of freight. And of course, there are many operators who are based in the United States, international companies, and of course the cruise industry, whose ships are governed by IMO regulations. And as part of the regulation in 2018, every ship owner is required to report the emissions from every vessel over 5,000 gross registered tons that is effectively regulated by the IMO, to report their emissions data, to have it verified by a recognized organization, which in practice is a classification society, and to log that data with the IMO. So that regulation of the IMO enabled us to design the Poseidon Principles. And we were a voluntary coming together of 11 international lenders to the shipping industry. And we drafted the Poseidon Principles in cooperation with many ship owners and also with the support of Lloyd's Register and UMass, the University Maritime Advisory, based on UCL. They're well-known academic advisors, including to the IMO. Next slide, please. As I said, this is about transparency. This is about reporting emissions in order to create the transparency that a global baseline will give us to help work towards the greater good of society, which is reducing harmful environmental factors. Shipping is one of the hard-to-abate industries, and shipping, of course, is important to every other industry in the mover of international trade. So everything that we can do to reduce the emissions in the shipping industry benefits everyone else. So the greater goal here, something that I know David and I will have no difficulty agreeing on, is what we're doing here is trying to be transparent for the benefit of society as a whole, and taking, in this case, a regulation that the IMO came up with that actually makes shipping one of the most transparent industries in reporting its initiatives and its emissions. Next slide, please. The Poseidon Principles at the moment only is looking at the environment. There could be other issues that we come to look at, but obviously as financial institutions, we need to be looking at things that have data that we can use. This is not, as some people have encouraged us to do, this is not to become political or to get into other societal issues which are not the responsibility directly, at least of banks. So our focus in the Poseidon Principles today is just on environmental issues, and the membership is anyone who lends or lessors that are effectively lenders rather than owners to the industry, and financial guarantors. And we have a number of export credit agencies. If we go to the next slide, please, Megan, you will see the most recent membership of Poseidon Principles, which is 35 international lenders and export credit agencies, mainly in Europe and Asia. And at the moment, Citi is the only US-based lender that is a member, but we are the only major US bank that is very active in lending to the industry. Now, I'll go through the principles very quickly. If we go to the next slide, please. There are four principles here. One is assessment, which is essentially assessing the results of the emissions in the portfolio against a trajectory that we have defined as getting to zero, effectively getting to zero by 2050. So we need the data to do that. Accountability is really relying upon the global regulator and the professional and neutral organizations like classification societies that will essentially give us the assurance that the data we're using has been correctly calculated and that we're using it correctly. The only issue of enforcement is that we should get the data. It's an obligation of our lenders, of our borrowers rather, that they provide us that data. This is about transparency, not about compliance. Poseidon Principles is a framework for transparency, not for using the information for other ends. Individual lenders might use that data in discussions with their clients as to the progress being made by that client in their reduction of emissions, but it is not a feature of the Poseidon Principles. And the transparency is an important point because we disclose that publicly in our report, and we issue our 4th annual report in December. Now, there are some other slides, but I'm not going to go through those because it will get in the way of our conversation. But if you go to the website that was on the front page, when you get the slides, you'll see our 4th annual report there. You'll see the detail of the methodology we use, and I would encourage people who are interested to go to the website and look at that. But that, Megan, is enough of the slides. Let's go to the conversation, and I'll hand back to Alan, at least for the time.
David, I'm offering you the opportunity to make some introductory remarks.
That means I can't talk for the next 20 minutes. As
long as Michael.
The underline. No, I think I don't need to talk to the audience about Blue Sky Maritime Coalition and what we're doing. I will maybe just open with ultimately transparency is what's fundamental here, and transparency and the quality of data that makes up that transparency are going to be critical to getting to net zero. But I don't think there is near enough discussion about how the data will be used or what data is relevant to be in a position to jump into a set of principles where, and it's not just the MIO, which is more of a 4-letter word than a 3-letter acronym in the US, but when you think about what we're solving here is a system problem. It's a global problem. It doesn't matter if one company does great unless the entire world changes in step with each other. And so we need to spend a lot of time thinking first about collecting data, not for the use directly of assessment, accountability, or enforcement. So the first 3 principles. If it's about transparency, it means the data should not be collected by government bodies. They should be collected anonymously to get a baseline of where the system is. And whether we're talking about any aspect of transitioning, I think data is it's the one thing that it's the technology that's future proof that you cannot make a wrong investment in. But as we've proven over and over again, if you rely on calculations rather than direct measurements of things like greenhouse gases, you can make the wrong decisions on what is good behavior, what is bad behavior. And I think we're still too immature in the accuracy and the understanding of data to start doing things like holding people accountable for good or bad performance. We haven't even defined what good and bad is yet until we get a baseline. And there's a lot of stories we can get into on that, but that would be my introductory remark, Alan.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Michael. Let's start the discussion. Michael, by my reckoning, there are no more than 20 US banks making Jones Act loans today, of which I estimate that roughly half are arrangers, the balance are syndicate members. In the absence of measurable standards in the US, how can these Jones Act lenders push the process that you described forward, or are they hamstrung? Are there any specific incentives that banks can offer owners today who want to go green?
Let me answer that by coming back on what David said, because I think we certainly in the Poseidon Principles benefited from the IMO's regulation. But I always say we're guided by, not dependent upon. Therefore, there may be things that the IMO does that we don't feel is appropriate to use in either being useful to transparency or to as David made the point, being necessarily useful for other reasons. I mean, we should not assume that the IMO's regulation is good necessarily from the perspective of other players in the value chain. But as the global regulator, it does have significant influence, and therefore, when we are looking at other institutions or other commitments that banks have made, and in particular, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, relevant to at least half the signatories, having data that enables us to measure things in a way that is accepted, because it's about acceptance as much as anything else, then it can be useful. So in the context of international banks that are signatories to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, there we are talking about the allocation of capital. Therefore, transparency of emissions in the shipping portfolio compared to a energy portfolio, a consumer portfolio, become relevant. So there, the data is relevant. Whether it is perfect or not is another matter. But I do think, and this is where I would disagree with David, you can't stop data getting into the wrong hands. In fact, many people think the internet should never have been invented for some of the damage that it has done. But of course, once it is there, and now data can be live streamed, but it is about what are you measuring and what you do with that. And I think, to answer your question, we had the IMO as an international body. The equivalent does not really exist in a North American context, in the sense that different government departments are responsible for different things. I think this is an opportunity for the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition, and it can do it on a confidential basis, to design something with those 20 vendors to actually come up with some form of measurement. And on my flight over from London yesterday, I was reminding myself about some of these fantastic pieces of work that have been done by the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition on estimating emissions from different parts of the North American maritime water transport industry as a whole. So I think I would take the initiative through the BSMC with those lenders. And as I said, we did the Poseidon Principles with ship owners on our drafting committee. So I think, Alan, you and other owners, if you like, of those assets could play a very important role in helping define it. Now, what I would say is the credibility of the BSMC and the group it pulls together to do that will be important from who you are, but then you're going to have to make some painful choices maybe about what it is you're measuring and how. Now, the fact is you can now live stream emissions from the stack on any piece of maritime equipment. So if it can be done, someone is doing it already, if the equipment's there. And therefore, if you don't, and in a way, that's what we did as the Poseidon Principles. We forward-thinking, if you like, international lenders could see that things like the TCFD were going to put an onus on us from within our institutions to do something. And the risk we had is that whatever got done might be done by people who didn't understand the industry. We might have something imposed on us by people who did not love the shipping industry, who didn't understand the shipping industry. So there was an element of defensiveness that we, people in the business working with our clients, should design something that was acceptable to them as well as to us. When we started, I met with Rocky Mountain Institute and World Bank, who wanted to tell me which ships we should finance and not finance. And I explained to them that is not how we do financial finance. And so I think this is a great opportunity that partly addresses David's concerns, but the best way of addressing them is take ownership as the BSMC of this process.
Yes, so I know that, sorry, I'm just going to converse. Our policy and regulatory workstream within Blue Sky has a little more than a year ago put together an advocacy to different government agencies that we need to start making monies available that help the demand side of transitioning fuels or energy sources rather than just the supply side, because it's never really worked very well for government to get involved in the supply side of things. And what we had suggested is what we really need is some money, not even a huge amount of money, but there's no ROI for the ship owner operators to spend it themselves. There's no implication that would make them go do it in a very low cost, low margin business, but put some money into actually monitoring the top 10 or 12 greenhouse gases and figure their CO2 equivalent in the stacks. Because where we've done that, we've learned things that help us understand that the IMO CII calculation just is wrong. And it's wrong by a lot in different types of vessels and even large tankers and certain types of operating service. We also found out one of our member companies, Harvey Gulf, puts measuring devices on their LNG offshore supply vessel. And they found out that when you slow steam, the methane slip is so high that you dwarfed what the engine puts out by burning hydrocarbons into CO2. So you never ever slow steam an LNG carrier or an LNG engine. We need LNG vessels with multiple engines so that you can just turn on one of them to get 20% power, turn on two of them to get 40% power or whatever. Because what we're here to do is figure out what we can learn about true greenhouse gas emissions, what's really bad for the environment, not what just satisfies an oversimplification of something that's easy for people to measure, but can give you the wrong answers. We've also learned through some of our other members that even if you're bunkering diesel today or marine fuel oil, if you bunker at two different spots, your emissions profile for burning that fuel can be off by 30 to 40%. Because there's a company called Fuel Trust that does a molecular analysis, sort of a digital twin, if you will, of the fuel that you bunker. But different refineries that make the fuel can have different slates of crude oil that lead to different types of trace components. So we don't really know, potentially within 30 or 40%, what our emissions are. We don't know where to prioritize. We don't know what the problems are. But we also don't have a direct line of sight between ROI and installing these devices. But where we can learn amazing things and get down really close to net zero operation, which is what Harvey Gulf proved, just by the understanding from data. So if there's one thing that I think we're trying to advocate is, let's stop using calculations to approximate measurement and start measuring, because that technology, while it's still not perfect, is advancing as fast as digital technologies in every arena are advancing.
I'm going to shift the conversation a little. Michael, one of the conceits, my word, of foreign flag shipping today is that while owners are contracting for the construction of dual fuel vessels, less than a fraction of these vessels are in fact running on alternative fuels, which for the majority means LNG. This is not to fault the owners for being progressive enough, but to highlight John Hatley's 5 A's concerning alternative fuels: abundance, availability, affordability, assignment, and arbitrage. And we're just not there yet. So Michael, has getting owners to build dual or even tri-fuel vessels enough for the Poseidon Principles members to declare victory, even though the vast majority of these vessels are not using alternative fuel today?
There is no victory. The victory will come when we have moved to a means of transporting with no emissions that are harmful to the environment. So there is no point at which we will get other than, and this goes to the issue of the allocation of capital, when the technology in the vessels and the engines and the fuels are there, those financial institutions, and I mean and investors too, so this is not just about regulated banks, they will want to invest, they will want to lend against it. So the victory will come when we can lend to companies that want to buy those assets that can run on those fuels. But of course, creating the assets today that can run on these fuels is important, because those assets have a long life. No one wants to invest in a stranded asset, but it is quite possible and acknowledged that some of those dual-fueled ships that are not LNG dual-fueled, methanol, ammonia, whatever, may never run on the alternative fuel during their life. It is quite possible. I know it's difficult to say sitting here in New York, but there needs to be a carbon levy or tax or whatever. And what was significant about the IMO meeting last July was they have moved the global regulator to a well-to-wake. It's not full life cycle because it doesn't include the environmental impact of building the ship, but it includes where the fuel comes from. In that sense, it's well-to-wake. And in that sense, the benefits, say, LNG had on a CO2 basis is lost. But this is about reduction of emissions. We know that the shipping industry can meet the IMO's 2030 target without any new fuels. This is about continuing to lower emissions through both operational measures and new technology. And I think that is where the victory will come. The victory will come that we use existing technology to reduce emissions, and we are innovative around those new technologies that will make a difference. Now, the buying signal, because this is a point that often comes from people in the energy sector and even people who used to be in the energy sector, is there is no demand signal. The IMO sent a global demand signal by regulating the use of fuels in international trade. And that is why bodies like the COSA Alliance in the consumer business, if you like, the membership is the big consumer companies, they will drive this process. The fuels will come about. They're not a matter of whether chemically, scientifically they can exist. There's a cost factor which a carbon tax has to close that competitiveness gap, but it requires infrastructure, scale, and finance. And I did check on one Zoom call I was on, the market cap of Amazon is more than 3 times the market cap of Shell and Total put together. If Amazon wants to invest in alternative fuels, it will do so. It doesn't need to be told whether Shell and Total and other members of the energy sector will do it or not.
So, sticking with the same topic, David, the folks at the Rocky Mountain Institute just published an article last month entitled Reality Check: U.S. natural gas is not a cleaner alternative fuel. They put the word cleaner in quotations, title telegraphs their opinion. David, keeping in mind that our membership consists of the largest owners of harbor assist and inland push boats, do you view LNG as an acceptable interim step for us?
I am fuel agnostic. I view everything as an acceptable interim step in terms of my litmus test, the mission of Blue Sky is this the fastest way to accelerate to net zero? And there's different opinions on that. And I welcome the argument. I welcome the dissent because that drives more innovation. I do think on the inland space, we've got to figure out a drop-in fuel solution. You've got in the freshwater, you've got vessels that are 60, 70, 80 years on the water. Yeah, you're not going to come in, and even converting them to LNG is going to be a big challenge. They run on very low margins. They're incredibly efficient. If you look at the large tug and barge operations in the Mississippi River, they're the perfect breadth, depth, and height to go in the waterways, under the bridges, through the locks they have to do, and they're refueled at transit. And their fuel tanks are their ballast tanks. So to go in and change an entire industry like that, that's going to be on the water for, well above 50 years. And even our harbor assist tugs on the coast are typically in play for 50 years. And you can correct me if I have that number wrong, Alan, since that's
Are
your
you,
area, not
are
mine.
you stating then that you think retrofits are the answer?
Retrofits are going to be a big part of the solution. Figuring out a synthetic fuel oil or synthetic diesel that has a zero carbon footprint. A lot of that's not going to come till you figure out the cost of direct air capture and you're actually pulling carbon out of the air to make it negative. So then you put some of it back in the air. I think there's going to have to be a lot of solutions, with the title of this being, what can you do in the US or around this space? I think we can make a lot of incremental steps, but rather than, if they're already on LNG, they're probably going to be on LNG, and we've got to solve methane slip, and there's a lot of work being done on that. We've got to solve other things. I don't know the right answer. I know that 10 years ago, no one was talking about ammonia and methanol and green hydrogen at scale. And 10 years from now, there's going to be some other innovation that comes along, and we're going to have to deal with a lot of different types of fuel choices based on availability, based on scale, based on what type of operating service a particular kind of vessel is in a particular type of environment, doing a particular type of work. I just want us to roll up our sleeves and get to the conversation. The other thing that I'll say is that the last publication that Michael was reading on the plane right over here, thank you for that, I appreciate that, was our Pathways to Net Zero, which, if you just look at this from a change management process of what principles make any change work and what principles absolutely kill it and its efficiency or its timeline. It's not having a vision of what the future looks like when you're done, the same vision for all the stakeholders, and not everybody trying to solve a different problem, and knowing what's in it for them. And then you have to work backwards from that to what things do we have to be working on. And I think we're all trying to solve a different problem. Ship companies are trying to solve the problem for their own ship company. Ports are trying to solve the problem for their own port. And if we don't start looking at this as one system, a system, and treating efficiency as like air traffic control, rather than just getting a better vessel than somebody else, or we're doomed to start with. And the other thing about change management, a really key principle is you never start with edicts from above. If you start with regulation, people will entrench themselves in resisting change, and you will not get, if we had till 2150, we're good. Doing this by 2050, you have to have regulation, you have to have edicts from above to get the last 20% across the finish line at the tail end of your transition. But you need those innovative thinkers that are free and creative to do whatever they want to do to really figure out how to solve this problem and get to that early critical mass of first movers that will drive the change. So read our publication if you haven't done so.
A follow-on question, a little simpler. I do not have an exact number as to how many harbor assist tugs and push boats are plying U.S.-Canadian waters today, but I can tell you that commercial shipyard capacity for both new buildings and, equally important, repair facilities is at best flat and maybe shrinking. David, what do you say to those who are convinced that our inability to build eco-compliant vessels or to retrofit them quickly enough will open the door to foreign-built boats, which in turn will spell the end of the Jones Act?
I don't see that happening.
Because
there's too many. Well, first of all, we started off quite early in the formation of Blue Sky that we were not going to challenge the Jones Act in terms of expanding it or contracting it, because it's too seated very, very deeply in its roots to national security. And I don't see anything that we're doing here as needing to change that or as driving the change for that. I do think that we need more US flag vessels in the international space. We can get into that. It's a totally different topic. But again, circling back to what I think fundamentally what we're talking about is, what is it going to take to get the transparent data we need to come up with the right answers and drive the right solution. So eventually, when we do start issuing edicts and things, we know they're based in real data that we have a lot of confidence in. Right now, we don't know what good looks like or what bad looks like because the data is so all over the
So
place.
just to drive the point home, you do not see any risk of early obsolescence for tugboats or push boats on the water today.
You know, you work for a tugboat operator. If I were a tugboat operator right now, it's really hard for me to figure out an ROI for definitely going to do dual fuel or a new alternative fuel right now. There's too much risk of a stranded asset. There's also massive risk in just continuing to build fuel oil vessels, heavy fuel oil or diesel vessels, because whatever the residual value you think it's going to be in 10 years, it's lower than it ever has been, and you're taking a big risk doing nothing. Again, as I said, to me, the most important investment is data. If you start putting monitors, which a lot of vessel owners are doing now, on the engines themselves, in the stacks themselves, you learn enough about how you do your operations to cut significant numbers in your emissions right from today. Get on the learning curve. The biggest value that Blue Sky has and why we have so many members in such a short time is because we've got members that are talking from every corner of the value chain. People have exposure to knowledge that are helping them in their day-to-day operations today, not just designed for the future. So jumping on the learning curve is the one thing that everybody has to do and starting to take advantage of data technologies.
Thank you. Michael, we're going to come back to finance. I want to touch on leasing. Since the inception of the Poseidon Principles, there's been an explosive growth in lease finance globally. I respect that a lot of this has to do with the various Basel Accords, but that's the reality of the situation. Now, I apologize if I don't have a good handle on what percentage of US-owned tugs and pushboats are mortgaged or leased. But to keep it simple, won't regulation just drive owners from banks into the hands of less regulated leasing companies? Before you answer, going back to your early days of the Poseidon Principles, how many customers did Citi lose because of your inability to finance them? And can you envision the same result here?
Let me start with your last question. I don't think so. We haven't lost any client because of the Poseidon Principles. I don't think any other signatory to the Poseidon Principles has lost a client either. If you've lost exposure, it's because the shipping industry is doing very well. Many ship owners have been paying back debt. Shipping industry as a whole is in a very, very good economic position. I think the issue around regulation, there are lots of different regulations that affect all of this. And one of the problems is the global regulators in different industries don't talk to each other. So whilst you have the financial regulators of international, of large banks, finalizing the so-called Basel Accords, none of the things that they're doing in that are actually have as a philosophy or policy to actually encourage capital towards addressing climate change. And that seems to me personally somewhat sort of a missing link. Now, of course, financial stability and how banks measure themselves is what they're focused on. But at some point, in order to get enough capital directed towards the innovative solutions, there's going to need to be some recognition by financial regulators. Now, for the lenders under the Jones Act, they had regulators too. And those regulators may be asking them to do certain things around disclosure. The 20 you name may not all, if any of them, be signatories to the Net Zero Banking Alliance. But whether it is at state level or federal level, there could easily be regulations that require them to, again, use data, as David quite rightly puts it, to use that data somehow to justify their lending decisions. I would say that the thing that is more focused by global regulators on anything other than financial stability is climate risk, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it is the ECB in Europe or the PRA in the UK, or even in Asia. Asia is not as advanced in that, and from a competitive position, Asian financial institutions, not totally, but Asian financial institutions benefit from not actually being governed necessarily by the same strictures that the Basel Accords put on it. But we're 5 years in, the first company that took Poseidon Principles and applied them from a corporate perspective within 1 month is International Seaways. International Seaways, it's an American company, maybe international flag. It's an American company said, how do we use the Poseidon Principles as an owner-operator to look at our fleet? And I think that emphasized the collaborative point that this is about working with our clients. So what in fact Poseidon Principles has done is spawn an industry of other people using the Poseidon Principles in some other way to help measure their performance. And I think that's why, that's why transparency and data are the two key themes here. Now, David doesn't want to be quite as transparent because he's slightly worried that Ronald Reagan's friend, I'm the government, I'm here to help, they come and take that from.
And I know that's never happened before. Right?
Well, we're used to it in Europe, and even in the UK, we've left the European Union. But now Europe has got the ETS come into force. So what the aviation industry managed to push back, shipping has not been able to push back.
Right.
But in a way, the EU was more advanced, and that is to do with maybe a view of the environment, whatever it is. I've always noticed how John Kerry never talks about fossil fuels. He's been very consistent talking about emissions, and so the role of carbon capture in a US context is much more talked about than it is certainly in Europe. But I do want to make it absolutely clear. We've gone from 11 members when we launched in June 19 to 35 now, including many governments in effect through their export credit agencies. The Japanese banks that have all joined see the change that will take place in future as a big opportunity for Japanese shipbuilding. And so it is about the whole value chain. And what is at the end of the value chain? It is the consumer. And the consumer is also usually, when they're grown up, a voter. In democracies, people will vote for lots of different reasons, but what's driving the consumer companies is their customers, the end consumer. And one of the great things about COVID was it actually, through means like Teams and Zoom, brought people in the value chain together in a way they wouldn't have done physically unless we'd been forced to communicate this way. We've advanced this whole agenda. There were topics we were talking about at Capital Link this morning, which 3 years ago, no one would have been discussing in that forum. And it is this whole industry discussion that has essentially moved to say there is a problem and we need to address it. But I agree fully with David. We need to be innovative here. We need to use the data, but there is no one easy solution. There will be multiple fuels in this industry, and we have to go into the production. The economic incentive to do that has to be applied through some sort of measure. But in the end, the consumer will have to pay for it. So if I can make one last point. 2023 was the hottest year on record. February 2024 was the hottest February ever on record. So whatever one's view of the data, the climate data is showing the planet has a real problem. And shipping is one of the hard to abate sectors, needs to address this problem as much as it can. But again, best done by the people who understand the industry and can make sure that we use the data appropriately.
If I could say one thing about regulation, and I know you want to get to the audience questions too, but if I think about, you're talking about financial regulators, if I think about the SEC here in the US, Security and Exchange Commission, person that may not know, they're basically saying for your scope 1, scope 2, now, if you put it in your plans, they're going to hold you accountable for it. That will cure some amount of greenwashing, but it's also going to discourage the people who are really trying to make a difference from doing something. You're better off not having a plan where there's no accountability. And that's the problem I have with too many things coming down from regulators. But lack of regulation is another problem. If you look at, well, first of all, we're going to be sharing all the same fuels with multiple different transport sectors. There's government agencies that have never had to work together before that are going to have to now. And because the US is very separate in its laws, which I think we can talk about, was that a mistake from the beginning or continues to be more of a mistake? But for inland vessels, we're not writing a lot of new regulation. And so you leave it up to the captain of every port to decide. That adds costs, that adds lack of certainty to lenders. That's going to drive up, it's going to, again, block us from getting where we need to go. So we don't need lack of regulation. We don't need too much regulation, but we need the type that incentivizes the people who are really trying to do the right thing to do the right thing. And again, we need a different type of data to make sure we're doing that with some level of accuracy.
Two more topics. One of the first lessons that I learned about the tugboat industry is that the way a tugboat makes money is over a long period of time. This lack of earnings volatility has largely, but by no means entirely, kept out private equity, and by that I'm lumping in distressed debt investors, out of the Jones Act. But building up green fleets is going to require a lot of capital. Do either of you see a role for private equity?
It's a yes/no question, so I can just say yes, right?
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes, because I think this requires innovation. One of the groups of investors that are actually much more in tune, if you like, with the direction are family offices. That is private equity in different forms. Some of the richest for all the different things he's doing are actually investing very heavily in this. I think, and use private equity in a broad way. There are some for whom this is going to take too long, where the return on investment is not going to be clear. But I think as the regulation begins to bite more, and remember the IMO has an agenda for global shipping, international shipping, that will sort out some of the definitional issues. It will make investing against the emissions defined by the shipping industry easier and clearer. Whether that then triggers the investment in these fuels and other things is another matter. But yes, the private sector, in the broadest sense, is how we will decarbonize the world. But there are areas where governments have to set frameworks. So whether that's through the IMO, whether it is domestically, in some respect, you cannot avoid the fact that the government will be there to help you. You have to educate them to do it the right way.
And I think if you get beyond the transition period between now and we get really close to net zero, nuclear is going to come on the scene. And you're going to put a device on your vessel, whatever size it is, that you never bunker for the next 30 to 50 years. And then you come back and there you're going to, and even if you don't even go that far, but you have fuels that are used by multiple industries, you can invest in a fuel technology and de-risk yourself by being across multiple types of transport and energy sectors as well. So there's, again, not my area of expertise, so I should probably shut up before I say something.
Last topic goes to David. In preparation for today's session, I must have read nearly a dozen papers on green corridors, including papers from the Maersk McKinney Moeller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping and our own American Bureau of Shipping. Their focus was primarily on ocean-going vessels and shoreside port infrastructure. I don't believe either of the two used the word tugboat or harbor assist vessels in their papers, preferring to lump them in with the term ports. For those who are not familiar how ports work in the US, they don't own their tugboats. David, while this may be considered heresy or fantasy, is it possible the quickest way to establish green corridors in the US is for the ports to build their own boats and hire companies to manage them?
No, and I really like the words heresy and fantasy because they're both very close to my heart. The Blue Sky is involved with multiple green shipping corridors. I think we're up to 8 of them now that we're either planning to launch or involved with. There's one that we are actually convening and running. It's in the Gulf of Mexico between Houston and just over towards like Mobile, Alabama, and lower Mississippi River, perhaps up as high as Memphis. But we use a totally different definition of green shipping corridor. So I would say what we need to do in the US is not be locked in to a definition of demonstrating a zero emission vessel moving product from point A to point B. Rather, we chose Gulf of Mexico and lower Mississippi. We set the boundaries of that because it's in that corridor, and shipping happens in corridors. It doesn't happen in a city. I mean, if you're a tug, maybe you spend most of your time in one port, but that corridor involves every single type of vessel and shipping movement, commercial or private, in the world operates. If we can solve greenhouse gas emissions in that small corridor, we've just solved the problem for the entire planet. So we're we're not restricting any type of innovation that needs to happen. And again, if you think about the vision of the future, the stakeholder list is 80% of the planet that it is involved with directly, indirectly, or benefits from, or causes stuff to move on the water. So that's what we're trying to do is not just push it into ports. We're trying to push the definition to think about where can we make the biggest difference in greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Politely called moving the goalposts.
Yeah. Hey, that's what innovation's about.
David, I still want to get something out of you on ports. They are in competition with one another. How do we get them to accelerate the establishment of corridors and work collaboratively?
Yeah, if I can be a little facetious, with apologies to any ports on the line, I think they mostly compete on ego. You know, who's the biggest port, who moves the most containers, who moves the most vessel movements every year. And there are very few ports that the stuff that they move aren't manufactured or grown within 100 miles of their port, or the stuff that they bring in that's consumed isn't done within 100 miles of their port. There's not a lot, not in the US to my knowledge anyway, a lot of real economic competition or competition for fuels or competition for technologies between ports. There is a, so I don't know, it's a psychology problem to solve rather than a technical problem, an economic problem, or an environmental problem to solve. In my,
Well, thank you for that.
very simply.
Before I ask David and Michael to make concluding remarks, Megan, are there any questions or anything in the chat?
No specific questions, but just wanted to remind folks that the slides and the recordings will be made available after.
In that case, I throw it. I want Michael to have the last word today as our guest. David, you're up.
No, over to
Oh,
you.
you got a question? Oh, I see Doug.
No, more of an applause for what's been presented here today. And Alan, you've done a beautiful job of asking great questions, so I really appreciate that. So well done, gentlemen. I appreciate the education we received today.
Yep, Mike, over to you, Michael. Sorry for closing comments.
Anything I haven't covered?
Well, you've covered tugboats quite a lot.
And push boats. Push boats.
Push boats.
Well, I haven't, with apologies, I don't know enough about ferries.
Look, and there's another organisation called the C40, which are 40 cities with major ports, so globally, which are also focused on this issue. And I think let me be tactless, but I intend to be tactful. The Jones Act, I remember I met John Snow when he was chairman and CEO of Sealand to talk about how Citi could help him sell Sealand. He announced the sale to Maersk the following day without our help. But one thing he said to me in that conversation when we talked about the Jones Act, and he had been Gerald Ford's budget director, was every time a budget came from Congress up to the White House, the repeal of the Jones Act was always near the top and was always deleted. And he said, hell will freeze over before the Jones Act is repealed. Well, you talked about a coming ice age where hell may have frozen over. Now it seems to be the reverse. But I think the point is that this is, as David said, this is a problem for the planet as a whole. This is where parochiality is not going to be a solution. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for solutions to be invented everywhere and then applied locally as may be appropriate. So in this sort of context, something like the Poseidon Principles, which is not about compliance, that's a separate issue, but is about transparency and taking data that is available because a global regulator insisted it be made available. It is saying, how can the US do something similar? Because at some point, someone is going to ask for it. The US consumer is going to ask for it. And therefore, for the participants in the value chain in a US context, which includes those Jones Act lenders, as we did at an international level, it's better to take the initiative and work with your clients, your borrowers, to come up with something that then you are able to articulate as to what you need to know and understand, and also then how you can use that actually to potentially lend or invest into some of those innovative solutions. And I think what we've also seen in the last few years is not just the sort of the leaders in the industry, the well-known global players, but we've seen people from outside the industry come in with offering their own technical solutions, which pre-COVID, most of the people in the industry weren't interested in listening to. And that's the great thing that's happened, that the agenda broadly for this industry is hugely different to what it was 5 years ago. Slow steaming is a solution, but unlike some people say, it's not the only solution. And I think in a US context, therefore, we would be very happy as the Poseidon Principles Association to allow a group of lenders here to use our brand, if you like, but to design a system that worked in the context of the North American version, that showed that using the available data 5 years ago, without the IMO regulation, we'd still be talking about what to do. Now, because the technology exists to get that data, BSMC has a membership that has all the expertise to help design the right system. Now, whether your government wants it or not seems to me irrelevant. The customers of that waterborne transportation will want to know what the answer is.
It's actually better if the government doesn't want it, so that we can do it voluntarily with anonymity and really start to highlight the issues. So no, thank you. I couldn't agree more.
We'll end on that high note. So again, I'd like to thank David and Michael for participating, and I'd like to thank everyone who logged in for this as well.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. We will circulate an email after the session and hope to be in touch soon. Thank you so much.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Well done.
Thanks.